I never thought I'd become the kind of man who plots revenge in the quiet hours before dawn. But there I was, 72 years old, sitting in my kitchen at 4 in the morning with a cup of black coffee and a heart full of rage that burned hotter than anything I'd felt in my 6 decades of marriage. The thing about getting old is that people start treating you like you're invisible. Like your eyes don't work anymore, like your brain has turned to mush, like you're just some harmless old fool shuffling around in his slippers waiting to die. My son-in-law Derek certainly thought so. He had no idea that I saw everything he did that Tuesday morning in October. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted with your daughter's life, someone you welcomed into your family like your own son, then you know exactly what I felt when I watched him slip that small plastic bag into the side pocket of my hiking backpack. The backpack I'd used for 40 years of weekend trips with my late wife Eleanor. The backpack that held more memories than most people collect in a lifetime. But before I tell you what was in that bag, and what I did about it, I need you to understand something. I need you to hit that subscribe button right now, because what I'm about to tell you is going to make you question everything you think you know about family, trust, and justice. And I guarantee you've never heard a story like this one. My name is Frank Kowalski, and this is the story of how my son-in-law tried to destroy me, and how I made him pay for it in ways he never saw coming. It started 6 months ago, when my daughter Sarah brought Derek home for Sunday dinner. She was 34 then, a successful accountant who'd never been married, never even had a serious boyfriend as far as I knew. Eleanor and I used to worry she'd end up alone, but after Eleanor passed 3 years ago, I stopped worrying about Sarah's love life and started worrying about my own loneliness. Derek seemed perfect at first glance. Tall, clean-cut, worked in finance, drove a BMW, wore expensive suits. He had this way of speaking that made everything sound important, even when he was just asking for the salt. Sarah looked at him like he'd hung the moon, and after watching my daughter spend her 30s focused on her career, I was just happy to see her happy. The first red flag should have been how quickly things moved. 3 weeks after that first dinner, Derek was practically living in Sarah's apartment. 2 months later, he proposed with a ring that cost more than most people make in 6 months. Sarah said yes before he even finished asking, tears streaming down her face like she'd won the lottery. I should have been thrilled. Instead, I felt this cold knot in my stomach that I couldn't explain. Maybe it was father's intuition, or maybe it was just the cynicism that comes with age, but something about Derek felt off. Too smooth, too perfect, too good to be true. But Sarah was glowing. She'd call me every day with wedding plans, talking about venues and flowers and dresses, her voice bubbling with excitement I hadn't heard since she was a little girl on Christmas morning. How could I tell her that her Prince Charming made my skin crawl? How could I rain on her parade with nothing but gut feelings and old man paranoia? So I kept my mouth shut and played the happy father-in-law to be. I helped pay for the wedding, walked her down the aisle, gave a toast at the reception about how Derek better treat my little girl right or he'd answer to me. Everyone laughed like it was a cute joke from the overprotective dad. Derek laughed too, but his eyes stayed cold when he looked at me over his champagne glass. The wedding was beautiful. Sarah looked radiant in Eleanor's grandmother's dress, the one she'd been saving for 40 years. Derek looked handsome in his $1,000 tuxedo, playing the part of the devoted groom to perfection. They honeymooned in Italy for 2 weeks, sending postcards and photos that looked like they belonged in a travel magazine. When they got back, Derek suggested they move into a bigger place. Sarah's apartment was too small for a married couple, he said. They needed something that reflected their new status, their combined success. Sarah agreed immediately, the way she'd started agreeing to everything Derek suggested. That's when I started noticing the changes in my daughter. Subtle at first, she stopped calling as often, stopped coming over for our weekly dinners, stopped wearing the jewelry her mother had left her. When I asked her about it, she'd brush me off with excuses about being busy, about Derek preferring quieter weekends at home, about wanting to start fresh with new things. The new house was a monument to Derek's ego. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a kitchen bigger than my entire first floor, all decorated in black and white and chrome like something from a magazine spread. It felt cold to me, sterile, nothing like the warm, lived-in homes Sarah had always loved. But she turned me around like she was showing off a palace, pointing out the marble countertops and the wine fridge and the walk-in closets like they were the most wonderful things in the world. Derek was always there during my visits, hovering close to Sarah, steering conversations away from anything too personal, too much about the past. He had opinions about everything. The restaurants Sarah used to love weren't sophisticated enough anymore. Her old friends were holding her back. Even the books she read were beneath her new station in life. I watched my daughter disappear piece by piece, replaced by this polished version that said all the right things and smiled at all the right times but never quite looked me in the eye anymore. When I tried to talk to her alone, Derek would appear with some urgent matter that needed her attention, some social engagement they were already late for, some excuse to cut our conversation short. The final straw came during Christmas dinner. Sarah had always insisted on hosting at her place since Eleanor died, keeping our family traditions alive even in her small apartment. But this year, Derek announced they'd be spending Christmas at his parents' house in Connecticut, 3 hours away. It would be their first Christmas as a married couple, he explained, and his family had expectations. I spent Christmas alone for the first time in 72 years. Sarah called in the evening, her voice strained and distant, telling me about the 12-course dinner and the string quartet, and the gifts that cost more than my monthly pension. She sounded exhausted, like she was reading from a script Derek had written for her. That's when I knew I was losing her. Not to natural growth or healthy independence, but to something darker. Derek wasn't just changing Sarah, he was erasing her, replacing her with some trophy wife version that fit his image of success. And there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it except watch and wait, and hope she'd come to her senses before it was too late. But Derek had other plans. Plans that involved making sure I was completely out of the picture. Plans that started with that plastic bag he thought I didn't see him slip into my backpack on that October morning when he thought this old fool was too blind and stupid to notice what was happening right under his nose. He was wrong about that. Dead wrong. The morning Derek planted whatever was in that bag, I'd driven over to their house to drop off some of Eleanor's recipe cards that Sarah had asked for. She wanted to try making her mother's famous apple pie for Derek's birthday party the following weekend. It was the first time in months she'd shown interest in anything from our family's past, and I was so happy about it that I practically floated to their front door. Derek answered before I even knocked, like he'd been watching from the window. He was dressed for work in one of his expensive suits, but there was something different about him that morning. Nervous energy, maybe? His smile was too wide, his handshake too firm, his voice too loud when he called for Sarah to come downstairs. She appeared in her bathrobe, hair still messy from sleep, looking more like my little girl than she had in months. The sight of those recipe cards in my hands made her eyes light up in a way that reminded me so much of Eleanor that my throat tightened with emotion. While Sarah flipped through the cards, reading her mother's handwritten notes, and asking questions about ingredients and techniques, Derek kept checking his watch and muttering about being late for work. Finally, he kissed Sarah goodbye with theatrical affection and headed for the garage, but not before suggesting I should probably head home soon too. That should have been my first clue that something was off. Derek never cared about my schedule before. I spent another hour with Sarah, the best hour I'd had with my daughter in months. She made coffee the way Eleanor used to, strong and black with just a hint of cinnamon, and we sat at her kitchen table talking about family recipes and holiday traditions like we were planning to bring them back. She even mentioned maybe hosting Christmas dinner this year, saying she missed having the whole family together. When I finally got ready to leave, Sarah walked me to the mudroom where I'd left my backpack. I always carried it with me, old habits from decades of hiking and camping with Eleanor. These days it mostly held my medications, reading glasses, a thermos of coffee, and whatever random items I'd accumulated during my daily errands. Sarah hugged me goodbye at the door, a real hug that lasted longer than the polite embraces I'd been getting for months. She smelled like the vanilla lotion Eleanor used to wear, and for a moment I could almost pretend my family was whole again. I was halfway home when I realized I'd forgotten my reading glasses. I'd taken them off to look at the recipe cards and left them on Sarah's kitchen table. I almost kept driving. I had another pair at home, but those glasses had been Eleanor's, and losing them would have felt like losing another piece of her. So I turned around and drove back to Sarah's house. That's when I saw Derek's BMW in the garage. The man who'd been in such a hurry to get to work 15 minutes ago was still home. I parked on the street instead of the driveway, something instinctive telling me to be careful. The front door was locked now, but I had a key Sarah had given me for emergencies. I let myself in quietly, calling out softly so I wouldn't startle anyone. No answer. I could hear voices from upstairs, Derek's voice, low and intense, and another voice I didn't recognize. A man's voice with a rough edge that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I crept closer to the staircase, my heart pounding in a way that reminded me I wasn't as young as I used to be. "Old man's perfect," the stranger was saying. "Diabetic, takes medication, lives alone. If something happens to him, who's going to question it?" Derek's response made my blood turn to ice water. The timing has to be right. Sarah can't suspect anything. She's already starting to ask questions about her trust fund, and if her father dies under suspicious circumstances. I couldn't hear the rest. The words were buzzing in my ears like angry wasps, making it hard to think clearly. They were talking about killing me. My own son-in-law was upstairs in my daughter's house, planning my murder with some stranger whose voice sounded like it belonged in a back alley. But why? What could Derek possibly gain from my death? Then I remembered Sarah mentioning her trust fund. The trust fund Eleanor and I had set up for her when she was born, fed by decades of careful saving and smart investments. The trust fund that would become Derek's too, once they were married. The trust fund that would be worth even more if something happened to me and my life insurance and savings were added to it. The voices were moving, footsteps heading toward the stairs. I had maybe 30 seconds to get out of there without being seen. I grabbed my reading glasses from the kitchen table and slipped back outside, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key back in my pocket. I sat in my car for 10 minutes, trying to process what I'd heard. My son-in-law wanted me dead. Not just gone, not just out of Sarah's life, but actually dead. And he had help, someone who sounded like he'd done this kind of thing before. Part of me wanted to drive straight to the police station. But what would I tell them? That I'd heard a conversation that might have been about me, or might have been about someone else entirely? That my son-in-law, who had no criminal record and was respected in his community, was planning to murder me for money? They'd think I was a paranoid old man losing his grip on reality. Hell, maybe I was. But then I remembered the way Derek had been acting lately. The questions about my health, my medications, my daily routines. The suggestions that I should update my will, get my affairs in order, make sure Sarah would be taken care of if anything happened to me. At the time, I thought he was being thoughtful, maybe even caring about his new family's security. Now I realized he'd been gathering intelligence. I drove home in a daze, my mind spinning with possibilities and fears. How long had Derek been planning this? Had Sarah ever suspected anything, or was she as much a victim as I was? What exactly were they planning to do to me, and when? The answers started coming sooner than I expected. That afternoon, Derek called to invite me to lunch later in the week. He wanted to talk about Sarah's birthday present, he said. Something special that would show her how much her family meant to him. His voice was warm and friendly, the voice of a concerned son-in-law who wanted nothing more than to make his wife happy. The voice of a man who'd been planning my murder just 6 hours earlier. I accepted the invitation, of course. What else could I do? If I was going to figure out what Derek was up to, I needed to play along. I needed to be the harmless old fool he thought I was. But I also started taking precautions. I installed new locks on my doors, changed my daily routines, started carrying a small digital recorder in my shirt pocket. If Derek and his friend were going to move against me, I wanted evidence of it. 3 days later, Derek took me to lunch at an upscale steakhouse downtown. He was charming as always, asking about my health, my hobbies, my plans for the holidays. He seemed particularly interested in my hiking routine, Did I still go out to the state park every weekend? Did I always take the same trails? Did anyone ever join me, or did I prefer to go alone? I answered his questions carefully, giving him just enough information to seem cooperative without revealing anything that might help him hurt me. Yes, I still hiked every weekend. Yes, I usually went alone since Eleanor died. No, I didn't always take the same trails, but I had my favorites. What I didn't tell him was that I'd started carrying that digital recorder on my hikes too, and that I'd begun varying my routes and timing in ways that would make it harder for someone to predict where I'd be at any given moment. Derek paid for lunch with a gold credit card and shook my hand warmly when we parted ways. He even suggested we should do this more often, spend more time together as family. His grip lingered just a moment too long, his eyes studying my face like he was memorizing it. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that conversation I'd overheard, about the stranger's rough voice and Derek's cold calculation. I kept wondering what method they'd chosen, what would make my death look natural enough that Sarah wouldn't ask too many questions. The answer came the following Tuesday morning, when Derek slipped that plastic bag into my hiking backpack and thought I didn't see him do it. I didn't open that plastic bag right away. Part of me was afraid of what I'd find, and part of me wanted to catch Derek in the act of whatever he was planning. So I left it where he'd hidden it, and went about my morning routine, all the while knowing that somewhere in my backpack was evidence of my son-in-law's intention to kill me. The weight of that knowledge sat on my chest like a stone. Every breath felt deliberate, every heartbeat a small victory against whatever Derek had planned for me. I'd survived 72 years on this planet, including a tour in Vietnam and 43 years married to a woman who could argue the paint off a wall when she was riled up. I'd be damned if I was going to let some slick-talking financial advisor with delusions of grandeur put me in the ground. But first, I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. I waited until after lunch, when the morning coffee had worked its way through my system and my hands were steady enough to handle whatever I might find. I spread a clean towel across my kitchen table, put on the reading glasses Eleanor had left me, and carefully opened that plastic bag. Inside were 3 small vials of clear liquid, each no bigger than my thumb, along with a folded piece of paper with handwritten instructions. My hands were shaking again as I unfolded that paper, but not from fear this time. From rage. The instructions were written in Derek's neat handwriting, the same careful script he used to sign birthday cards and Christmas presents. But these weren't instructions for assembling furniture or programming a remote control. These were instructions for murder. Add 1 vial to morning coffee or water bottle during hike. Onset within 30 to 45 minutes. Symptoms will mimic heart attack. Use all 3 vials if subject survives first dose. Dispose of empty vials in different locations along trail. Below that, in different handwriting, presumably from Derek's accomplice, were additional notes about timing and location. They'd been watching me, studying my hiking routine, mapping out exactly where on the trail I'd be most vulnerable. They knew I always stopped at Miller's Rock about 2 miles in to rest and drink coffee from my thermos. They knew the trail was isolated enough that if I collapsed there, it might be hours before anyone found me. They'd planned my death down to the minute. If you've ever held evidence of someone's plan to kill you, you know there's no feeling quite like it. It's not just fear, it's a complete rewriting of reality. The person you thought you knew, the family you thought you belonged to, the safety you thought you had, all of it crumbles in an instant, leaving you standing in the ruins wondering how you missed the signs. But I hadn't missed all the signs. I'd seen Derek's true nature in glimpses, the cold eyes when he thought no one was looking, the way he talked about people like they were obstacles to be removed, the gradual isolation of Sarah from everyone who might interfere with his plans. I just convinced myself it was paranoia, the suspicion of an overprotective father who didn't want to share his daughter with anyone. Now I knew better. I took photographs of everything, the vials, the instructions, the bag itself. Then I carefully resealed everything and put it back exactly where Derek had hidden it. Whatever this poison was, whatever it would do to me, I couldn't let Derek know I'd discovered it. Not yet. Not until I had a plan of my own. The rest of that day passed in a haze of adrenaline and disbelief. I kept catching myself doing normal things, watching the news, watering Eleanor's roses, organizing my pill dispenser for the week, and remembering that according to Derek's timeline, I might not live to see the weekend. That evening, Sarah called to check on me. Her voice sounded strained, distant, like it had been for months. But now I wondered if it was more than Derek's influence making her sound that way. Did she know about his plans? Was she part of them, or was she as much a victim as I was? "Dad, are you okay?" she asked when I didn't respond to her question about whether I'd gotten the recipe cards to work for Eleanor's apple pie. "You sound different." For a moment, I considered telling her everything. About the conversation I'd overheard, about the poison in my backpack, about the husband she loved plotting to kill her father for money. But what if she didn't believe me? What if Derek had poisoned her mind against me so thoroughly that she'd think I was making it all up? What if she was actually part of the plan? "I'm fine, sweetheart," I told her instead. "Just tired. You know how it is when you get to be my age." She laughed, but it sounded forced. "You're not that old, Dad. You're still hiking every weekend, still sharper than most people half your age." There it was again, a reference to my hiking routine. Was she fishing for information, or was it innocent conversation? I couldn't tell anymore. The paranoia was starting to eat at me, making me question every interaction, every relationship, every assumption I'd built my life on. "Maybe I should start taking it easier," I said, testing her reaction. "Skip the hiking for a few weeks, stay closer to home." "Oh no," she said quickly, too quickly. "You love your hiking. Mom always said it kept you young. You shouldn't give up the things that make you happy just because you're getting older." She was encouraging me to keep hiking, to stick to my routine, to be exactly where Derek expected me to be when he decided it was time to use those vials. My own daughter was helping to set me up for murder. Or was she? The more I thought about it, the more I realized Sarah might not know anything about Derek's plans. She might genuinely believe that hiking was good for me, that I should maintain my routines and stay active. Derek was smart enough to manipulate her concern for my well-being into encouragement for the very activities that would make me vulnerable to his attack. But I couldn't take the chance. If there was any possibility that Sarah was involved, I had to protect myself from her too. The realization hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath and making my chest ache in ways that had nothing to do with my age or my heart condition. I was completely alone. That night, I sat in Eleanor's chair with a glass of whiskey and thought about what to do next. Going to the police still seemed pointless. Derek was too smart to leave a trail they could follow, and his accomplice was obviously someone who knew how to make murders look like accidents. The poison he'd given me would probably be untraceable after a few hours, designed to mimic a natural heart attack in a diabetic man with a history of cardiac issues. But Derek had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated me. He saw what he wanted to see, a lonely old widower whose best days were behind him, someone who could be disposed of without much effort or risk. He didn't see the man who'd survived combat in Southeast Asia, who'd built a successful business from nothing, who'd fought insurance companies and government bureaucrats and nosy neighbors for 5 decades and won more often than he'd lost. Derek thought he was dealing with a victim. He was about to learn he'd picked a fight with a survivor. I spent the next 3 days planning my counterattack. I researched the poison Derek had given me, using the library computers to avoid creating a digital trail from my home. The substance was a synthetic compound designed to cause cardiac arrest, virtually undetectable unless you knew exactly what to look for and tested for it within hours of exposure. It was professional-grade poison, the kind of thing you couldn't just buy online or cook up in your basement. Derek's accomplice wasn't some random criminal. He was connected to serious people who did this kind of work for a living. That revelation should have scared me more than it did. Instead, it made me angry. Derek hadn't just decided to kill me on impulse or in a moment of greed. He'd hired professionals. He made it his business to end my life as efficiently and cleanly as possible. Well, two could play at that game. I started by documenting everything I'd discovered, creating a detailed record of Derek's plans and my evidence against him. I wrote it all out longhand, making multiple copies and storing them in different locations. If something happened to me despite my precautions, I wanted the truth to come out eventually. Then I began gathering intelligence on Derek himself. His real background, his finances, his associates, his weaknesses. If he wanted to play deadly games, I was going to make sure I understood the rules better than he did. The picture that emerged over those 3 days of research was disturbing but not entirely surprising. Derek's success in finance was built on a foundation of fraud and manipulation. He'd been skimming money from client accounts for years, using new investments to pay off old debts in a classic Ponzi scheme that was starting to collapse. He needed Sarah's trust fund to keep his house of cards from falling down. And he needed me dead to access it without interference. But Derek had miscalculated in more ways than one. He'd assumed I was helpless, isolated, and easy to eliminate. He'd assumed Sarah was completely under his control. And he'd assumed that no one would look too closely at the convenient death of an old man with health problems. He was wrong on all counts. By Friday morning, I was ready to turn the tables on my would-be killer. The predator was about to become the prey, and Derek was going to learn the hardest lesson of his privileged life. Some old dogs still have plenty of bite left in them. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that made my arthritis ache and my mood turn dark. Perfect for what I had planned. I dressed carefully in my hiking clothes, made sure my digital recorder was working and hidden in my shirt pocket, and loaded my backpack with everything I'd need for the day ahead. Including those 3 vials of poison Derek thought would kill me. But I wasn't planning to be the one who got poisoned. I'd spent Thursday night preparing for every contingency I could think of. I'd written detailed letters to the police, the FBI, and the district attorney's office, explaining everything I'd discovered about Derek's plans and providing copies of all the evidence I'd gathered. Those letters were sealed in envelopes and stored in my safety deposit box at the bank, along with instructions for my lawyer to open them if anything happened to me. I'd also prepared a little surprise for Derek, something that would give me the upper hand in whatever confrontation was coming. He thought he was dealing with a helpless victim, but I'd learned a few things about chemical compounds during my research. Things that would make his professional-grade poison work against him instead of for him. The drive to the state park took 45 minutes, and I spent every one of them thinking about Sarah. Was she really innocent in all this, or was she helping Derek plan my murder? I still didn't know for sure, but I'd decided it didn't matter. Whether she was victim or accomplice, I was going to save her from the monster she'd married. Even if she never forgave me for it. I parked in my usual spot at the trailhead, noting that there were only 2 other cars in the lot. Good. Derek would want as few witnesses as possible for whatever he had planned. I shouldered my backpack, checked my watch, and started up the trail at my normal pace. Miller's Rock was exactly 2 miles in, a granite outcropping that offered a perfect view of the valley below. Eleanor and I used to stop there on every hike, sharing coffee and sandwiches while we watched hawks circle in the thermals. It was peaceful, isolated, and far enough from the main trail that casual hikers rarely bothered with the detour. It was also the perfect place for an old man to have a fatal heart attack without anyone being around to help him. I reached the rock at exactly 9:30, right on schedule according to my usual routine. The coffee in my thermos was still hot, and I poured myself a cup while I waited. Derek would be along soon, probably with his accomplice. They'd want to make sure the poison worked, maybe even stay around long enough to discover my body and call for help. They'd played the role of the grieving family member and the helpful stranger who just happened to be hiking in the area. By the time the paramedics arrived, I'd be beyond help, and the poison would have metabolized enough to be undetectable in any routine autopsy. It was a good plan. Professional. Clean. The kind of plan that had probably worked for them before. But they'd made one fatal assumption, that their victim would actually consume the poison they'd so carefully prepared for him. I heard footsteps on the trail about 10 minutes later. 2 sets, moving quietly but not quite quietly enough for someone who'd spent time in the jungle listening for enemy patrols. I stayed where I was, sipping my coffee and pretending to enjoy the view while my heart hammered against my ribs. Derek appeared first, dressed in expensive hiking gear that looked like it had never seen a real trail before this morning. Behind him came a man I didn't recognize, average height, unremarkable features, the kind of person you'd forget 5 minutes after meeting him. Except for his eyes. His eyes were the flat, cold gray of a winter sky, empty of anything resembling human warmth. This was Derek's accomplice. The professional killer who'd helped plan my murder. "Frank!" Derek called out, his voice full of false surprise and manufactured warmth. "What a coincidence running into you out here." I turned toward them with what I hoped was a convincing smile. "Derek! Good to see you, son. And you are?" I extended my hand toward the stranger. "This is Tom," Derek said quickly. "We work together. He's thinking about buying some property out this way, so I offered to show him some of the hiking trails." Tom's handshake was firm but brief, his eyes never quite meeting mine. "Beautiful area," he said in that rough voice I remembered from the conversation I'd overheard. "Very peaceful." The word carried weight, like he was already imagining how peaceful it would be once I was dead. "Mind if we join you?" Derek asked, already settling onto the rock beside me. "Tom's never been hiking before, and I thought you might have some advice for a beginner." "Of course," I said, gesturing for Tom to sit as well. "Always happy to help a fellow nature lover." We made small talk for a few minutes about the weather, the trail conditions, the wildlife in the area. Derek was performing his role perfectly, the concerned son-in-law spending quality time with his wife's father. Tom played the curious newcomer, asking questions about the local area and hiking safety that were probably designed to establish his presence here as innocent and coincidental. All the while, I could see them both watching my coffee cup, waiting for me to drink enough of the poison to ensure my death. They didn't know I'd dumped the coffee out earlier and refilled the thermos with plain water. They didn't know the real poison was sitting in a different container entirely, waiting for the right moment to be deployed. "You know, Frank," Derek said after about 15 minutes, "Sarah's been worried about you hiking alone out here. Maybe you should consider bringing someone along for safety. Or at least letting people know your exact route and timing." There it was, the setup for his alibi. He was establishing that I hiked alone, that my death would be an unfortunate accident that could have been prevented if only I'd been more careful about my safety. "Sarah worries too much," I replied, taking a small sip from my cup. "I've been hiking these trails for 40 years. I know what I'm doing." Derek nodded sagely, but I could see the anticipation in his eyes. He thought the poison was working its way through my system, that any minute now I'd start showing the first symptoms of cardiac distress. Tom was checking his watch frequently, probably calculating how long it should take for me to collapse. They were both about to be very disappointed. "Actually," I said, setting down my cup and reaching into my backpack, "since you're both here, there's something I'd like to discuss with you." I pulled out a manila envelope and placed it on the rock between us. Derek's eyes immediately locked onto it, and I saw the first flicker of uncertainty cross his face. "What's that?" Tom asked, his voice sharper now, more alert. "Evidence," I said simply. "Evidence of a plot to murder me, involving my son-in-law here and his professional accomplice. Evidence that's currently stored in multiple locations, with instructions to be turned over to law enforcement if anything happens to me." The transformation in Derek's face was something to behold. The mask of false concern and family devotion slipped away, replaced by something cold and calculating and utterly without conscience. This was the real Derek, the man Sarah had never seen but who'd been living in her house, sleeping in her bed, planning her father's death. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice had lost its warmth. "You're obviously confused, maybe having some kind of episode. Tom, I think we should get him back to the parking lot, maybe call for medical help." Tom was already moving, reaching into his jacket for something that was probably a weapon. But I'd been expecting this. I pulled out a small spray bottle filled with a concentrated solution I'd prepared from Derek's own poison, enhanced with a few chemical modifications I'd learned about during my research. "I wouldn't move if I were you, Tom," I said quietly. "This bottle contains enough concentrated poison to kill both of you in about 30 seconds if it gets in your eyes or mouth. And at my age, my hands aren't as steady as they used to be." Both men froze. Tom's hand was halfway to whatever he was reaching for. Derek was half standing, preparing to run or fight. They were both staring at that spray bottle like it was a live grenade. "Now," I continued conversationally, "here's what's going to happen. Derek, you're going to call Sarah and tell her you're divorcing her. You're going to sign papers giving up any claim to her money, her property, or her future inheritance. And then you're both going to disappear from my family's life forever." "You're insane," Derek snarled, but he wasn't moving. "You can't prove any of this. You're just a paranoid old man who—" I squeezed the spray bottle just enough to send a fine mist toward his face. Derek jerked backward so violently that he nearly fell off the rock, his hands flying up to protect his eyes. "Careful, son," I said softly. "These things can be unpredictable. Especially when you're dealing with someone who has nothing left to lose." The fear in Derek's eyes was genuine now. He was finally beginning to understand that he miscalculated, that the helpless victim he targeted was actually a dangerous adversary who'd been planning his own moves while Derek thought he was calling the shots. But this was just the beginning. Derek and Tom might be professional killers, but I was something they'd never encountered before, a dead man who'd refused to die, with all the advantages that brought, and none of the constraints that had held me back when I still thought I had a future to protect. "You want proof?" I asked, reaching into my backpack again. This time I pulled out the original plastic bag with its deadly contents, along with copies of the photographs I'd taken and printouts of my research into Derek's financial crimes. "How about the poison you planted in my backpack? Or the detailed instructions for my murder written in your own handwriting? Or maybe the evidence of your Ponzi scheme that's about to collapse and take half your client's retirement funds with it?" Derek's face went white. Tom looked like he was calculating whether he could reach me before I could deploy the spray bottle. Neither of them had expected this level of preparation from their intended victim. "Here's what I know," I continued, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "Derek's been embezzling money from his clients for 3 years. He's used new investments to cover old losses, classic Ponzi scheme territory. But the scheme is collapsing, and he needs Sarah's trust fund to keep it afloat long enough for him to disappear with whatever money he can salvage." Tom shot Derek a look that could have cut glass. "You didn't tell me about any financial crimes," he said quietly. "You said this was just about an inheritance." "The old man doesn't know what he's talking about," Derek said quickly, but sweat was beading on his forehead now. "He's senile, paranoid." "I'm many things," I interrupted. "But senile isn't one of them. I've got bank records, client statements, email correspondence. Enough to put you away for 20 years even if we forget about the murder conspiracy." The dynamic between Derek and Tom was shifting, and I could see the cracks forming in their partnership. Tom was a professional killer, but he was also a businessman. Working with someone whose crimes could bring unwanted law enforcement attention was bad for business. "You've got nothing," Derek said, but his voice lacked conviction now. "Even if you did, who's going to believe a bitter old man over a respected financial advisor? Sarah certainly won't." That's when I played my ace in the hole. "Sarah already knows," I lied smoothly. "I told her everything yesterday. About your financial crimes, about your plan to kill me, about your professional friend here. She's probably talking to the FBI right about now." The look of pure terror that crossed Derek's face told me everything I needed to know. He hadn't prepared for the possibility that Sarah might turn against him. His entire plan depended on her remaining loyal, isolated, and under his control. "You're lying," he whispered, but there was no conviction in it. "Call her," I suggested. "Ask her where she is right now. Ask her what she's doing today." Derek's hand went to his phone, then stopped. He was trapped between his need to know if I was telling the truth and his fear of what he might discover. Tom was watching this exchange with growing alarm, probably realizing that his carefully planned murder had turned into a potential disaster that could expose them both. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the wind through the trees and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Eleanor and I used to love watching those hawks, marveling at how they could ride the thermals for hours without flapping their wings. Now I felt like I was riding my own kind of thermal, using Derek's fear and uncertainty to keep myself aloft in a situation that could turn deadly at any moment. "What do you want?" Tom asked finally. He was the practical one, focused on damage control rather than emotion. "Money? A cut of whatever Derek's running? Name your price." I almost laughed at that. These men still didn't understand what they were dealing with. They thought everyone had a price, that every problem could be solved with the right combination of money and violence. They'd never encountered someone who'd already lost everything that mattered to him and had nothing left but the burning need to protect what remained of his family. "I want Derek to disappear," I said simply. "I want him out of Sarah's life, out of her finances, out of her future. I want him to sign papers giving up any claim to her money or property. And I want both of you to understand that if anything happens to me or my daughter, there are people who will make sure you pay for it." "And if we refuse?" Derek asked, some of his arrogance returning. I smiled at him, and it wasn't a nice smile. "Then I call the FBI, the SEC, and every news outlet in the state. Your financial crimes become front-page news, your clients sue you for everything you've ever owned, and you spend the next 20 years in federal prison. Tom here probably disappears before the indictments come down, but you don't have that luxury, Derek. You're too visible, too invested in your respectable facade." Tom was nodding slowly, recognizing the wisdom of cutting his losses. "He's right," he told Derek. "This job's blown. Too much exposure, too many complications. We need to abort." But Derek wasn't ready to give up. The desperation was making him dangerous, unpredictable. He'd built his entire identity around his success, his wealth, his ability to manipulate and control others. The thought of losing everything, of having to start over with nothing, was more than his ego could handle. "No," he said, standing up abruptly. "I'm not walking away from millions of dollars because some old fool got lucky and figured out part of what was happening. We stick to the plan. The poison should be working by now anyway." He looked at my coffee cup, then at me, confusion replacing anger as he realized I was showing no signs of cardiac distress. "Why aren't you dying?" I finished. "Because I didn't drink your poison, son. I dumped it out an hour ago and refilled the thermos with water. Your little surprise is currently feeding the wildflowers down the trail." Derek's face cycled through disbelief, rage, and something approaching panic. His carefully constructed plan was falling apart, and he was losing control of the situation in ways he'd never anticipated. That's when he made his final, fatal mistake. Derek reached into his jacket and pulled out a gun. It was a small pistol, probably a .38, the kind of weapon that would make a neat hole and not too much noise in the wilderness. Tom looked as surprised as I was. Apparently firearms hadn't been part of their original plan. "Put that away," Tom hissed. "Gunshots will bring rangers, hikers, everyone within a mile radius. This is supposed to look like natural causes." But Derek was beyond listening to reason now. His perfect scheme was unraveling, his carefully constructed life was crumbling, and he was facing the prospect of losing everything he'd worked so hard to steal. The gun was shaking in his hand, not from fear but from rage, and I realized I was looking at a man who'd finally reached his breaking point. "Shut up," he snarled at Tom, then turned the weapon toward me. "You think you're so smart, old man? You think you've won? All I have to do is shoot you right here, dump your body in the ravine, and tell everyone you had an accident. Sarah will believe me. She always believes me." "No, she won't," I said quietly, reaching slowly into my shirt pocket. "Because she's been listening to this entire conversation." I pulled out my digital recorder, the red light still blinking to show it was active. Derek's eyes locked onto that tiny device like it was the most dangerous thing on the mountain. "You're lying," he whispered, but the gun in his hand was wavering now. "I've been recording everything since you arrived," I continued. "Your confession to planning my murder, your discussion of the poison, your admission of financial crimes. And this recorder isn't the only one. I've got backup devices hidden all over this area, all of them broadcasting to a secure server that uploads everything to the cloud in real time." That was a lie, of course. I only had the one recorder, and it wasn't connected to anything except the local memory storage. But Derek didn't know that. The man who'd made his living through deception and manipulation was discovering what it felt like to be on the receiving end of a well-crafted bluff. "Even if you kill me right now," I continued, "it won't matter. The evidence exists. The FBI already has copies of everything I've discovered about your financial crimes. And Sarah." I paused for effect, watching Derek's face carefully. "Sarah's been working with them for the past week." The gun dropped to Derek's side as the full implications of what I was saying hit him. His daughter-in-law, his primary victim, his key to financial salvation, she'd been playing him the entire time. Except she hadn't. Sarah didn't know anything about Derek's crimes or his plan to kill me. But Derek's guilty conscience and paranoid mind filled in the blanks, creating a conspiracy that existed only in his imagination but felt completely real to him in that moment. "That's impossible," he said, but his voice was hollow now. "Sarah loves me. She trusts me. She would never." "She's been suspicious for months," I lied smoothly. "The changes in your behavior, the questions about my routine, the way you kept pushing her to update her will and insurance policies. She's not stupid, Derek. She just needed someone to help her see what was really happening." Tom was backing away from both of us now, recognizing that the situation had become completely unstable. Professional killers don't like witnesses, and they especially don't like witnesses to their partners having complete mental breakdowns in public places. "I need to go," he muttered, edging toward the trail. "This is way beyond what I signed up for." Derek spun toward him, the gun coming back up. "You're not going anywhere. We finish this, or we all go down together." "Put the gun down, son," I said, using the same tone I'd used with Sarah when she was small and having a tantrum. "You're not thinking clearly. This isn't going to end the way you want it to." But Derek was beyond reason now. The mask had completely fallen away, revealing the desperate, vicious man underneath. This was who Sarah had been living with for months, the predator who'd been sharing her bed while planning her father's murder. "No," he said, raising the weapon toward me again. "I'm finishing this. You die, Tom disappears, and I go home to my grieving wife who's about to inherit everything I need to disappear myself." That's when I heard the sound that Derek had been too distracted to notice. Footsteps on the trail, multiple sets, moving with the careful precision of people who know how to approach dangerous situations. "Frank Kowalski?" a voice called out. "This is Agent Martinez, FBI. We need everyone to remain calm and keep their hands visible." Derek's head snapped toward the sound, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. But I wasn't surprised. I'd been counting on this moment for the past hour. You see, I hadn't lied about everything. I really had contacted the FBI about Derek's financial crimes. I really had provided them with evidence of his Ponzi scheme. And I really had arranged for them to be in the area this morning, though not quite in the way Derek was imagining. 3 agents emerged from the tree line, weapons drawn but not aimed directly at us. They spread out in a semicircle, controlling the space while keeping their options open. Agent Martinez was a woman in her 40s, professionally calm but alert to every nuance of the situation. "Derek Patterson," she called out. "We have warrants for your arrest on charges of securities fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit murder. I need you to put down the weapon and step away from Mr. Kowalski." Derek's gun was shaking violently now, swinging between me and the agents as he tried to process this new development. Tom had disappeared completely, probably melting into the forest like the professional he was. He'd survived to commit crimes another day, but Derek's story was about to come to an abrupt end. "How?" Derek whispered, looking at me with something approaching awe. How did you? I told you I was recording everything, I replied. What I didn't mention was that the recorder had a live audio feed to a phone in my pocket, and that phone was connected to a conference call with the FBI. They've been listening to this entire conversation. It was actually much simpler than that, but Derek didn't need to know the details. Sometimes the best lies are the ones that contain just enough truth to be believable. Sarah? He asked, his voice breaking. Is she really? Sarah's safe at home, Agent Martinez said. She's being interviewed by other agents, but she's not in any danger. Unlike you, Mr. Patterson. The fight went out of Derek all at once. The gun clattered to the rock as he collapsed, his head in his hands, the weight of his crimes and failed schemes finally crushing what was left of his arrogance. He looked like what he'd always been underneath the expensive suits and smooth talk, a small, greedy man who'd gotten in over his head and dragged innocent people down with him. Frank, Agent Martinez said, holstering her weapon as her colleagues moved in to secure Derek. We're going to need a full statement from you. But first, are you injured? Do you need medical attention? I looked down at myself, surprised to realize I was completely unharmed. An hour ago, I'd been facing two professional killers with nothing but an old man's cunning and a burning desire for justice. Now Derek was in custody, Tom was fleeing into the wilderness, and I was still alive to tell the tale. I'm fine, I said, and meant it for the first time in months. Just fine. But even as the agents led Derek away in handcuffs, even as I gave my statement and handed over all my evidence, I knew this was only the beginning. Derek might be finished, but there were still questions to answer, wounds to heal, and a daughter who was about to learn some very difficult truths about the man she'd married. The hardest part was still ahead of me. The drive home from the FBI field office took 2 hours, but it felt like a lifetime. Agent Martinez had been thorough but respectful during my debriefing, asking detailed questions about Derek's crimes and my investigation into them. What she hadn't asked, what I hadn't volunteered, was how I'd really orchestrated Derek's downfall. The truth was both simpler and more complex than the story I'd let Derek believe. Yes, I'd discovered his plan to kill me. Yes, I'd gathered evidence of his financial crimes. But the elaborate surveillance setup, the live audio feed to the FBI, the coordinated arrest, that had all been improvised in the moment, built on a foundation of careful preparation and a lifetime of learning to think on my feet. The real breakthrough had come 3 days earlier, when I'd finally worked up the courage to call Sarah and tell her everything I'd discovered. Not the version Derek feared, where she was already working with law enforcement, but the painful truth about what her husband really was. She hadn't believed me at first. How could she? I was asking her to accept that the man she loved, the man she'd built her future around, was not only a criminal but a would-be murderer. The conversation had lasted 3 hours and left us both emotionally drained. But Sarah was her mother's daughter, and Eleanor had raised her to face hard truths even when they hurt. By the end of our talk, she'd agreed to help me gather more evidence against Derek, while I contacted the FBI about his financial crimes. The part about the recordings being broadcast live had been pure theater, designed to make Derek panic and reveal more than he intended. The FBI agents showing up at exactly the right moment had been mostly luck. They'd been planning to arrest Derek at his office later that day, but when I called Agent Martinez that morning and told her Derek might be planning to kill me during my hike, she'd sent a team to the park just in case. Everything else, Derek's confession, his complete breakdown, his revelation of details that sealed his fate, had been the result of an old man's desperation and a lifetime of experience dealing with bullies and cowards. Now I had to face the hardest part of all, helping my daughter pick up the pieces of her shattered life. Sarah's car was in my driveway when I pulled in, and I could see her silhouette through the kitchen window. She'd been waiting for me, probably for hours, and I knew the conversation ahead of us would be one of the most difficult of my life. She met me at the door with red eyes and a face that looked like it had aged 10 years in the past week. Without a word, she wrapped her arms around me in a hug that felt like she was trying to squeeze the life back into both of us. "I'm so sorry, Dad," she whispered against my shoulder. I'm so sorry I didn't believe you sooner. I'm so sorry I let him. I almost lost you because I was too blind to see what he really was. You have nothing to apologize for, I told her, holding her tight. Derek fooled a lot of people. He was good at it. We sat in Eleanor's kitchen, the same kitchen where Sarah had learned to bake cookies and do homework and talk through the problems of growing up. Now she was facing problems that would have seemed impossible back then: a marriage built on lies, finances tangled with criminal activity, a future she'd have to rebuild from scratch. The FBI agent said Derek's been stealing money for years, she said, staring into her coffee cup. Millions of dollars. From retirement funds, college savings, people's life insurance payouts. How did I not know? How did I live with him for 8 months and never see any signs? Because he didn't want you to see them, I replied. Men like Derek are experts at compartmentalizing their lives. The Derek you knew at home wasn't the same Derek who was running financial scams at work or plotting murder in hotel rooms. Sarah flinched at the word murder, and I immediately regretted my bluntness. But she needed to understand the full scope of what Derek had been planning, both for her own healing and for her own safety. Agent Martinez said Tom, Derek's accomplice, got away? She continued. What if he comes back? What if there are others involved in this? It was a legitimate concern. Professional killers don't usually work alone, and Derek's crimes had potentially exposed a network of people who wouldn't appreciate the attention his arrest would bring to their operations. The FBI is investigating all of Derek's connections, I assured her. And I've taken some precautions of my own. Security cameras, new locks, a few other measures you don't need to worry about. What I didn't tell her was that I'd also reached out to some old friends from my military days, men who'd stayed in touch over the decades and who understood the kind of protection that official law enforcement couldn't always provide. If Tom or anyone else came looking for revenge, they'd find out that this particular old man had resources they hadn't counted on. Sarah was quiet for a long time, working through emotions I couldn't imagine. Grief for the marriage she'd thought she had. Guilt over the part she'd unknowingly played in Derek's schemes. Relief that her father was alive. Terror at how close she'd come to losing everything. There's something else, she said finally. Something Agent Martinez told me that I need to discuss with you. I waited, knowing this was going to be bad news. Derek convinced me to change my will 6 weeks ago, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. He said it was just smart financial planning, making sure everything was set up properly for married couples. I named him as the primary beneficiary of everything, including my trust fund. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Derek hadn't just been planning to kill me for my money, he'd been positioning himself to inherit Sarah's fortune too. If his plan had worked, if I'd died of an apparent heart attack on that hiking trail, Sarah might have been his next victim. We're changing it back, I said firmly. First thing Monday morning. It's not that simple, Sarah replied, and I could hear the fear creeping into her voice. The will was part of a larger financial restructuring that Derek arranged. He moved money around, set up new accounts, changed insurance policies. Agent Martinez said it might take months to untangle everything, and some of it might never be recovered. Derek's final act of cruelty, even in defeat, even facing decades in prison, he'd managed to inflict lasting damage on the woman he'd claimed to love. Sarah wasn't just losing a husband, she was losing her financial security, her sense of safety, possibly her faith in her own judgment. But she was alive. We were both alive. And as long as we were breathing, we could rebuild whatever Derek had tried to destroy. We'll figure it out, I told her. Together. The same way your mother and I figured out how to raise a family on a construction worker's salary, how to save for your college education, how to survive 43 years of marriage. Money's just money, Sarah. Family is what matters. She was crying now, the kind of deep, cleansing tears that come when you finally allow yourself to feel the full weight of what you've survived. I held her hand and let her cry, remembering all the times Eleanor had done the same thing when Sarah was small and the world seemed too big and scary to handle. What happens now? She asked when she could speak again. Now we go on living, I said. Derek goes to prison, you get your life back, and I get to keep my daughter safe. Everything else is just details. But even as I said it, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. Derek's arrest was just the beginning of a long legal process that would dredge up painful details and force Sarah to relive her worst mistakes over and over again. There would be depositions and testimony, media attention and public scrutiny, the judgment of people who would wonder how she could have been so blind to what her husband was really doing. There would also be practical concerns, rebuilding her finances, securing her home, dealing with the social and professional fallout of being married to a convicted criminal. The road ahead was going to be long and difficult, full of challenges either of us could anticipate. But we'd face them together. Derek had tried to isolate Sarah, to cut her off from everyone who might interfere with his plans. He'd failed in that just as completely as he'd failed in everything else. As the evening wore on, Sarah and I talked through the practical matters that couldn't wait. Security measures for both our homes, legal representation, financial advisors who could help sort through the mess Derek had made of her accounts. We made lists and plans and contingency strategies, the way Eleanor and I used to do when facing any major life challenge. It felt good to be useful again, to be needed for something more than just showing up for Sunday dinners and pretending everything was fine. Derek had tried to make me irrelevant to my daughter's life. Instead, he'd reminded both of us why family matters more than anything else in the world. By the time Sarah left that evening, she looked more like herself than she had in months. The fear was still there, and the grief, but underneath it all was something Derek had never been able to touch, the strength she'd inherited from her mother, the resilience that had carried our family through decades of ups and downs. Derek had underestimated both of us. He'd seen vulnerability where there was actually strength, isolation where there was actually deep connection, easy marks where there were actually survivors who learned to fight for what mattered most. He was about to spend the next 20 years thinking about that mistake. The trial began 6 months later, on a cold February morning that reminded me of the day Eleanor died. Sarah and I sat in the front row of the courtroom gallery, watching as Derek was led to the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit that made him look small and ordinary. Gone was the expensive suit, the confident swagger, the smooth charm that had fooled so many people for so long. In his place sat a man who'd aged 10 years and 6 months, his face gaunt and his eyes hollow with the knowledge of what he'd lost and what he was about to face. The federal charges against him read like a catalog of greed and betrayal, securities fraud, mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and a dozen other counts that added up to a potential life sentence. But seeing him there, defeated and broken, I felt no satisfaction. Only sadness for the waste of it all, and worry for my daughter, who would have to relive every painful detail of her marriage in open court. The prosecutor was a sharp young woman named Assistant District Attorney Chin, who'd spent months building an airtight case against Derek and his criminal network. She'd managed to flip 2 of his accomplices, including a financial advisor who'd helped him set up the fake accounts used to hide his clients' money. Tom, Derek's would-be killer, had never been caught. He'd disappeared into whatever underworld network had spawned him, leaving behind only a few aliases and a reputation for violence that made other criminals reluctant to discuss him with law enforcement. Agent Martinez assured us that the search was continuing, but I suspected Tom was long gone, probably working for new clients in a different state or country. The evidence against Derek was overwhelming. Bank records, email correspondence, recorded phone conversations, testimony from victims who'd lost their life savings to his schemes. And then there was my testimony about the attempted murder, complete with the poison vials and Derek's handwritten instructions that had been found in his house during the FBI search. Derek's lawyer tried to paint me as a paranoid old man who'd misunderstood innocent conversations and jumped to dangerous conclusions. But the physical evidence was damning, and Derek's complete breakdown during the confrontation at Miller's Rock had been captured on multiple recording devices I'd been carrying that day. When Derek took the stand in his own defense, it was like watching a man drowning in the consequences of his own choices. He tried to explain away the financial crimes as legitimate investment strategies that had gone wrong. He claimed the murder plot was just a fantasy he'd discussed with Tom but never intended to carry out. But when ADHM cross-examined him, asking him to explain the poison vials and the detailed written instructions, Derek's composure finally cracked completely. "He was ruining everything!" he screamed, pointing at me across the courtroom. "Sarah would never have been happy as long as he was controlling her life, filling her head with doubts about me. I was trying to free her from his manipulation." The courtroom erupted. Sarah gasped and covered her face with her hands. The judge called for order. Derek's lawyer looked like he wanted to crawl under the defendant's table and disappear. And I understood, finally, what Derek had told himself to justify attempted murder. In his twisted mind, I hadn't been an innocent victim but an obstacle to his happiness, a threat to the perfect life he'd constructed through lies and theft. Killing me wasn't murder, it was just removing a problem that stood between him and everything he felt entitled to have. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Derek showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, but I could see his hands shaking as he gripped the table in front of him. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month, but the outcome was never in doubt. Federal guidelines and the severity of Derek's crimes meant he'd spend the rest of his life in prison, with no possibility of parole before his 70th birthday. After the trial ended, Sarah and I walked out of the courthouse together into the gray February afternoon. She'd held up remarkably well during the 3 weeks of testimony, showing a strength I'd always known she possessed but had worried Derek might have destroyed. "Is it over?" she asked as we stood on the courthouse steps, watching Derek's victims and their families disperse into the city. "The legal part is," I replied. "The rest is up to you." She nodded, understanding what I meant. Derek was going to prison, his criminal network was being dismantled, and the immediate threat to our family was eliminated. But Sarah still had to rebuild her life, learn to trust again, find a way forward that didn't involve looking over her shoulder for the rest of her days. The financial recovery had gone better than expected. Derek's attempts to hide stolen money had been sophisticated but not perfect, and federal investigators had managed to recover about 60% of what he'd taken from his victims. Sarah's trust fund had been mostly protected by legal structures Derek hadn't had time to fully dismantle, though the process of securing her accounts had taken months of legal work. More importantly, Sarah had found a new job with an accounting firm that specialized in helping fraud victims rebuild their financial lives. It was meaningful work that let her use her professional skills while making amends for the crimes committed in her name. She threw herself into it with a dedication that reminded me of Eleanor during her most focused years. But there were still hard days. Nights when Sarah would call me because she'd woken up from nightmares about Derek, or because she'd seen something on the news that reminded her of the trial, or just because the loneliness of her empty house felt too heavy to bear alone. Those calls never bothered me. After coming so close to losing her completely, I treasured every sign that Sarah still needed her father in her life. 6 months after the sentencing, Sarah made a decision that surprised both of us. She sold the house she'd shared with Derek, despite the memories and the financial investment it represented, and bought a smaller place just 3 blocks from my home. Close enough that we could have dinner together whenever we wanted, but far enough that we both maintained our independence. "I want to be near family," she explained when she told me about the purchase. "Derek spent so much energy trying to isolate me from the people who really cared about me. I don't want to make that mistake again." Her new house was nothing like the cold, sterile showplace Derek had chosen. It was warm and comfortable, filled with photos of Eleanor and mementos from Sarah's childhood. She'd kept Eleanor's jewelry and china, the family recipes I'd given her, all the tangible connections to our shared history that Derek had tried to make her discard. She also started dating again, carefully and slowly, but with a growing confidence that the experience with Derek hadn't permanently damaged her ability to trust. The first few men she went out with were clearly intimidated by her story. Who wants to follow in the footsteps of a convicted attempted murderer? But eventually she met someone who saw her strength rather than her scars. His name was Michael, and he was a widowed high school teacher whose wife had died in a car accident 3 years earlier. He understood grief and recovery in ways that most people couldn't, and he had the patience to let Sarah heal at her own pace. When she brought him to Sunday dinner for the first time, I could see in her eyes the same happiness that had been there before Derek, but tempered now with wisdom and caution. Michael shook my hand with genuine respect and spent the evening asking questions about Eleanor, about Sarah's childhood, about the family history that Derek had tried so hard to erase. He wasn't trying to replace what we'd lost, he was trying to understand and honor it. "He's good for her," I told Agent Martinez when she called to check on us, as she did every few months. "Sarah deserves someone who sees her for who she really is." "And what about you?" she asked. "How are you holding up?" It was a fair question. The events of the past year had taken their toll on me too, in ways that weren't always obvious from the outside. I'd faced my own mortality in the most direct way possible, been forced to confront the reality that someone had wanted me dead, and lived through months of legal proceedings that kept those traumatic memories fresh and painful. But I was surviving. More than surviving, I was finding purpose again in ways I hadn't since Eleanor died. Being needed, being useful, being part of Sarah's recovery had given me reasons to get up in the morning beyond simple habit. I'd also started volunteering with a local organization that helped elderly people avoid financial scams and fraud. My experience with Derek had taught me how sophisticated these schemes could be, and how easily even smart, careful people could be victimized by someone they trusted. It felt good to turn my experience into something useful, to help other families avoid the kind of devastation Derek had tried to bring to ours. "I'm doing well," I told Agent Martinez. "Better than I have in years, actually." And it was true. Derek had tried to destroy my family, but he'd actually made us stronger. Sarah and I had been drifting apart before his crimes forced us to rely on each other again. The crisis had reminded us what we meant to each other, what we were willing to fight for, what really mattered when everything else was stripped away. Derek was serving his sentence at a federal prison in Pennsylvania, and as far as I knew, he'd never tried to contact Sarah or apologize for what he'd put her through. Maybe that was for the best. Some wounds heal better when they're left alone. But sometimes, late at night when I couldn't sleep, I wondered if Derek ever thought about the life he could have had if he'd been content with Sarah's love instead of obsessing over her money. If he'd seen her as a partner instead of a mark, a person instead of a means to an end. Those thoughts never lasted long. Derek had made his choices, and now he was living with the consequences. My job was to focus on the future, on helping Sarah build the life she deserved, on making sure that the family Derek had tried to destroy emerged stronger than ever. 2 years after Derek's conviction, Sarah called me on a Tuesday morning with news that made my heart sing for the first time since Eleanor's death. "Dad," she said, and I could hear the joy bubbling up in her voice. "Michael proposed. We're getting married." I sat down heavily in Eleanor's chair, overwhelmed by a mixture of happiness and relief that surprised me with its intensity. Sarah had not only survived Derek's betrayal but had found the courage to love again, to trust again, to believe in the possibility of a future built on truth instead of lies. "Congratulations, sweetheart," I managed to say past the tightness in my throat. "When's the wedding?" "October," she replied. "Small ceremony, just family and close friends. Michael doesn't have any family left except his sister in California, and I." She paused, and I knew she was thinking about all the people who wouldn't be there. Her mother, who would have cried happy tears and insisted on helping with every detail. The friends she'd lost during Derek's campaign to isolate her. The innocent version of herself that had believed in fairy tale endings. "And you want something different this time," I finished gently. "Exactly. Something real. Something that's about Michael and me, not about putting on a show or impressing people who don't really matter." The wedding planning was a completely different experience from Sarah's first marriage. Where Derek had pushed for the biggest, most expensive celebration possible, Michael was content with whatever made Sarah happy. Where Derek had opinions about every detail, from the color of the napkins to the band selection, Michael's only request was that Sarah wear something that made her feel beautiful. Sarah chose her mother's wedding dress, not the elaborate gown she'd worn for Derek, but the simple ivory dress Eleanor had married me in 45 years earlier. It needed alterations, of course, but when Sarah tried it on in the seamstress's shop, I saw my Eleanor standing there, young and hopeful and ready to begin her life with the man she loved. "What do you think, Dad?" Sarah asked, turning slowly so I could see how the dress looked from every angle. "Your mother would have been so proud," I said, and meant every word. The ceremony itself was held in the small church where Eleanor and I had been married, where Sarah had been baptized, where we'd held Eleanor's funeral service just 4 years earlier. Pastor Williams, who'd known Sarah since she was in diapers, performed the service with the kind of warmth and personal attention that made it feel like a family gathering rather than a formal event. Michael's vows were simple and honest, promising to love Sarah for who she was rather than who he wanted her to become. He spoke about second chances and unexpected blessings, about finding love when he'd given up hope, about building a future based on trust and mutual respect. Sarah's vows were more emotional, her voice breaking as she talked about learning to believe in love again, about finding someone who saw her scars as proof of her strength rather than evidence of her weakness. She promised to be his partner in every sense of the word, to face whatever challenges life brought them together rather than hiding behind walls of fear and suspicion. When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was gentle and full of promise. Nothing like the theatrical display Derek had orchestrated for his first wedding, but infinitely more meaningful. The reception was held in the church fellowship hall, decorated with Eleanor's favorite flowers and filled with the laughter of people who genuinely cared about Sarah and Michael's happiness. No string quartet or 12-course meal, just good food, good music, and the kind of celebration that comes from the heart. I gave a toast that night, raising my glass of champagne and looking out at the faces of family and friends who'd supported Sarah through the darkest period of her life. 2 years ago, I said, my daughter learned some hard truths about trust and betrayal, about the difference between love and manipulation. She could have let those experiences make her bitter and afraid. Instead, she chose to heal, to grow, to remain open to the possibility that real love was still out there waiting for her. I turned to look at Michael, this good man who'd had the patience to wait, while Sarah learned to trust again. Michael, I continued, you're getting a woman who knows the value of honesty because she's lived through the devastation of lies. You're getting someone who will never take love for granted because she knows how rare and precious the real thing is. You're getting my daughter at her strongest, her wisest, her most beautiful. The applause was thunderous, but what mattered most to me was the look on Sarah's face. Pure joy, uncomplicated by fear or doubt, or the shadows of past betrayals. For the first time since Derek had entered our lives, my daughter looked completely, genuinely happy. Later that evening, after the last guest had gone home and the cleanup was finished, Sarah and Michael stopped by my house before heading off to their honeymoon in Maine. Sarah was still in her wedding dress, though she changed out of her heels into comfortable flats. Thank you, she said, hugging me tight. For everything. For protecting me from Derek, for helping me heal, for walking me down the aisle today. I couldn't have done any of this without you. You did the hard work, I replied. I just reminded you that you were strong enough to handle it. Michael shook my hand with the firm grip of a man who understood the responsibility he was taking on. I'll take good care of her, he promised. I know you will, I said. But more importantly, you'll let her take care of herself. That's what Derek never understood. Sarah doesn't need someone to control her life for her. She needs someone to share it with. After they left for their honeymoon, I sat in Eleanor's chair with a glass of her favorite wine and thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. 3 years ago, Derek had nearly destroyed my family with his greed and violence. Tonight, Sarah was beginning a new chapter built on love and trust and mutual respect. If you've ever watched someone you love recover from betrayal, you know it's not a simple process. There's no magic moment when the healing is complete, no final victory that erases all the pain that came before. Recovery is a series of small choices, daily decisions to trust again, to hope again, to remain open to love despite the risk of being hurt. Sarah had made those choices every day for 2 years, and tonight she'd chosen to believe in love again completely. Not the fantasy version Derek had sold her, but the real thing, complicated and imperfect and sometimes difficult, but honest and lasting and worth fighting for. The best part was that she hadn't just survived Derek's betrayal, she'd used it to become stronger, wiser, more compassionate. Her work helping fraud victims had expanded into a nonprofit organization that provided counseling and financial planning services to people rebuilding their lives after financial crimes. She'd turned her worst experience into a source of help for others facing similar challenges. Michael had supported her work from the beginning, understanding that it wasn't just a job for Sarah but a calling born from her own experience with betrayal and recovery. He helped with the administrative side of the nonprofit, using his skills as a teacher to develop educational programs about financial fraud prevention. Together, they were building something meaningful from the ashes of what Derek had tried to destroy. It was the kind of love story Eleanor would have appreciated, not perfect, but real, based on shared values and genuine respect rather than fantasy and manipulation. 6 months after the wedding, I got a call that reminded me Derek's story wasn't completely finished. Agent Martinez called to tell me that Tom had finally been arrested, caught in a sting operation in Florida while trying to set up another murder-for-hire scheme. "He's talking," she told me. "Trying to make a deal with prosecutors. He's given us information about a whole network of people who were involved in Derek's financial crimes, including some who helped him plan your murder." The investigation that followed led to a dozen more arrests, and the recovery of millions of dollars in stolen funds. Derek's crimes had been even more extensive than anyone had realized, involving corrupt financial advisors, money launderers, and professional criminals across 3 states. But the most important revelation came when Tom told investigators about Derek's backup plan. If the poison hadn't worked, if I'd somehow survived the staged heart attack, Derek had arranged for a car accident on my drive home from the hiking trail. Tom would have run me off the road at a specific curve known for its dangerous conditions, making my death look like just another tragic accident involving an elderly driver. Derek hadn't just planned to kill me, he'd planned to keep trying until he succeeded. Learning about that backup plan should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt like vindication. My instincts about Derek had been right from the beginning. The man had been completely without conscience, willing to do whatever it took to get what he wanted. But he'd underestimated the strength of the family he'd tried to destroy. Sarah and I had not only survived his schemes but had emerged stronger and closer than ever. Derek was serving multiple life sentences, his criminal network was dismantled, and his victims were getting some measure of justice. Sometimes the good guys really do win. That night, I called Sarah to tell her about Tom's arrest and what it meant for the ongoing investigation. She listened quietly as I explained the details, including Derek's backup plan to stage a car accident if the poison failed. "He really wanted you dead," she said when I finished, her voice small and distant. "Yes," I replied. "He did. But I'm not dead, sweetheart. I'm right here, and I'm not going anywhere." "I know," she said. "It's just, sometimes I still can't believe I was married to someone capable of that. How did I not see it? How did I live with a monster for 8 months and think I was in love?" It was a question she'd asked before, one that would probably haunt her for the rest of her life. But I had an answer now that I didn't have in the beginning. "Because Derek wasn't a monster when you met him," I said. "Greed made him into one, piece by piece, choice by choice. The man you fell in love with might have been real, at least in the beginning. The monster who tried to kill me was what Derek became when his schemes started collapsing and he got desperate." "Do you really believe that?" she asked. "I believe people are capable of change," I said. "For better and for worse. Derek changed for the worse, but you've changed for the better. That's what matters now." After we hung up, I thought about that conversation and realized how much my own perspective had changed over the past 3 years. The anger and hatred I'd felt toward Derek during the crisis had gradually been replaced by something closer to pity. He'd thrown away everything that actually mattered: love, family, respect, freedom, in pursuit of money he didn't even need. He'd destroyed his own life as completely as he'd tried to destroy mine, and for what? A few $1,000,000 he'd never get to spend? In the end, Derek had been his own worst victim. He'd traded a real relationship with a wonderful woman for a prison cell and a lifetime of regret. He'd chosen greed over love, control over partnership, fantasy over reality. And now he'd spend the rest of his life thinking about that choice, knowing that he could have had everything he claimed to want if he'd just been content with what Sarah was freely offering him. That was punishment enough. Justice didn't require my hatred, it just required that Derek face the consequences of his actions. And he was doing that, one day at a time, for the rest of his natural life. 5 years have passed since that October morning when Derek slipped poison into my backpack. As I write this, I'm sitting in the same kitchen where Eleanor and I raised our daughter, where Sarah learned to cook and do homework and plan her dreams. But everything has changed in ways I never could have imagined back when I thought Derek was just an overconfident son-in-law who rubbed me the wrong way. Sarah and Michael's marriage has flourished in the way that real partnerships do, not without challenges, but with the kind of deep trust and mutual respect that Derek never understood. Their nonprofit has expanded to serve fraud victims across 3 states, and Sarah has become a recognized expert in financial recovery counseling. She speaks at conferences, testifies before legislative committees, and helps other families rebuild from the devastation of financial crimes. Michael has been her perfect partner in all of it, supporting her work while maintaining his own career as a high school history teacher. They complement each other in ways that make their relationship seem effortless from the outside, though I know they've worked hard to build the communication skills that Derek's betrayal made necessary. Last month, Sarah told me she's pregnant. Their first child, a daughter they plan to name Eleanor, is due in the spring. When she shared the news, sitting in Eleanor's old chair with her hands resting on her still small belly, I felt a completion I hadn't expected to experience again in this lifetime. Eleanor's legacy will live on in more than just memories and photographs. Our granddaughter will carry her name, her strength, and hopefully some measure of the wisdom that carried our family through its darkest hours. I want to tell her about her grandmother, Sarah said. All of it, the good times and the hard ones, the way Mom faced cancer with such grace, the way she taught us all to fight for what matters. But I also want to tell her about Derek, about what we learned from that experience. What do you want her to learn? I asked. That people aren't always what they seem. That trust has to be earned, not just given. That family is the thing worth fighting for when everything else falls apart. She paused, looking out the window at Eleanor's rose garden. And that even when terrible things happen, even when people try to destroy what you love, you can survive it if you don't face it alone. Those are good lessons for any child to learn, though I hope little Eleanor never has to learn them the way her mother did. Derek is still serving his sentence at the federal prison in Pennsylvania. According to Agent Martinez, who still checks in on us occasionally, he's been a model prisoner, quiet, cooperative, no disciplinary problems. He works in the prison library and has been taking correspondence courses in philosophy and literature. Sometimes I wonder if he's genuinely trying to understand what went wrong in his life, or if this is just another performance designed to impress parole boards he'll never actually face. I suppose it doesn't matter. Whatever Derek is doing with his remaining years, he's doing it far away from my family, and that's what counts. Tom received a life sentence for his role in multiple murder conspiracies, including the plot against me. The investigation that followed his arrest exposed a network of white-collar criminals who'd been operating for decades, stealing from retirement funds and insurance policies and anyone else whose money they could access through fraud and manipulation. Dozens of people went to prison. Hundreds of victims received partial restitution for their losses. It wasn't perfect justice. Some money was never recovered, some criminals escaped prosecution, some victims never got their lives back. But it was more justice than most fraud cases ever see. I've become something of a local celebrity in the victim advocacy community, the old man who refused to be a victim and helped bring down a criminal network. I get invited to speak at senior centers and community groups about financial fraud prevention, sharing the warning signs I learned to recognize too late in Derek's case. The irony isn't lost on me. Derek tried to kill me to keep me quiet, but his attempt on my life has given me a platform to help other people avoid similar schemes. He made me into the very thing he was trying to eliminate, an effective opponent of financial predators who prey on elderly people. If you've made it this far in my story, you're probably wondering if I have any regrets about how I handled Derek's betrayal. Would I do anything differently if I could go back to that October morning when I discovered the poison in my backpack? The honest answer is yes. I would have gone to the police immediately instead of trying to handle the situation myself. I would have trusted the system to protect me instead of putting myself and Sarah at risk with amateur detective work and improvised confrontations. But I also understand why I didn't make those choices at the time. Derek had isolated Sarah so effectively that I wasn't sure she'd believe me over him. The evidence I had was circumstantial at best, and Derek's respectable facade might have been enough to convince investigators that I was just a paranoid old man. More than that, I was angry. Derek had tried to kill me, but more importantly, he tried to steal my daughter's future. The protective rage that drove my actions was the same instinct that had carried me through combat in Vietnam and 43 years of marriage to a strong-willed woman who didn't suffer fools gladly. Derek mistook that protective instinct for weakness, assuming that an elderly widower would be easy to eliminate. He learned too late that some old men are more dangerous than they appear, especially when they're fighting for their family's survival. In the end, everything worked out better than I had any right to expect. Sarah not only survived Derek's betrayal but used it to become stronger and more compassionate. She found real love with Michael, built meaningful work from her painful experience, and is now preparing to pass on the lessons she learned to the next generation. Derek got the justice he deserved, and his victims got more closure than most fraud cases provide. The criminal network he was part of was exposed and dismantled, preventing future crimes against other families. And I got to keep my daughter, watch her heal and grow and find happiness again. I got to walk her down the aisle for a second wedding that was everything her first one pretended to be. I got to see her build a real partnership with a good man who values her for who she truly is. Most importantly, I got to become a grandfather again, to know that Eleanor's legacy will continue in a little girl who will grow up hearing stories about the grandmother she never met but whose strength and wisdom shaped the family that survived Derek's attempt to destroy it. As I finish writing this story, I can hear Sarah and Michael in the next room, discussing nursery colors and baby names and all the hopeful plans that come with expecting your first child. Their voices are full of the same excitement Eleanor and I shared when we were preparing for Sarah's arrival 43 years ago. The circle continues, as it always does. Life moves forward despite the people who try to stop it. Love persists despite betrayal. Families endure despite those who would tear them apart. Derek thought he could rewrite our story, make himself the hero and eliminate anyone who stood in his way. But stories aren't that simple. Real families, built on genuine love and tested by real challenges, are stronger than any single person's attempt to control or destroy them. Sarah's daughter will grow up hearing about Derek as a cautionary tale, a reminder that not everyone who claims to love you has your best interests at heart. But she'll also hear about how her mother and grandfather refused to let one man's evil define their family's future. She'll learn that trust is precious because it can be broken, that love is valuable because it requires courage, that family matters most when everything else falls apart. And if she's very lucky, she'll never need to use those lessons the way her mother did. But if she does, if someday she faces her own Derek with his own schemes and threats, she'll know that she comes from a line of survivors who don't give up, don't give in, and don't let anyone destroy what they've built together. That's Eleanor's real legacy, passed down through Sarah to little Eleanor and beyond. Not just the strength to survive betrayal, but the wisdom to recognize real love when it comes along, and the courage to fight for it when it's threatened. Derek tried to end our story. Instead, he just gave us a new chapter, one that proves even the darkest plot twists can't destroy a family built on genuine love and unshakable loyalty. That's the story I want you to remember. Not the story of how one man tried to commit the perfect murder, but the story of how a family refused to let him succeed. Not the story of betrayal and greed, but the story of love and justice and the triumph of good over evil in the most personal possible terms. Share this story with the people you love. Hit that subscribe button if you believe families are worth fighting for. Comment below if you've ever had to protect someone you love from someone who meant them harm. Because in the end, we all have a Derek story somewhere in our lives, someone who pretended to care while plotting our destruction, someone who smiled to our face while sharpening a knife for our back. The question isn't whether we'll encounter such people, but whether we'll be ready to recognize them when we do. Stay vigilant. Stay connected to the people who really matter. And never underestimate the power of an old man who's got nothing left to lose except the family he'd die to protect. My name is Frank Kowalski, and this has been my story. Thank you for listening, and remember, sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to die when someone wants you dead.